for Nonprofits and Philanthropy at the Bush School at Texas A&M University. And we host these webinars on a monthly basis. And today I'm happy to have Dr. Duchess Humphrey with us, who's going to lead us in a conversation regarding culturally competent leadership at nonprofit organizations. Just real quick to tell you just a bit about our center. We were founded in 2017, which is when I joined the university, and our mission is to support a vibrant nonprofit and philanthropic sector here in the state of Texas and beyond. And we tend to focus on research, professional outreach, and engaged learning. Some of the educational opportunities that we have at the Bush School are our Masters of Public Service and Administration program, our new certificate in nonprofit leadership, which is a continuing education course. And we're happy to announce that in the fall, we'll also launch our new certificate in social justice leadership. We also have a certificate in nonprofit management, which is a graduate certificate here at the Bush School as well. Just real quick on our values, of course, we value the nonprofit organizations that we work with and support across the state and beyond, of course. We believe in opportunity for all. So whether that be leaders within nonprofit organizations and those that they serve, everyone contributing to the good work that's going on in the sector. Of course, we have tons of expertise and board governance and leadership. And as we mentioned, engagement is highly important to us with regard to conducting sessions like this and more that I'll visit with you about at the end of today's session. Quickly on Dr. Humphrey's bio, she currently serves as an epidemiologist specialist and special project supervisor for the Tarrant County Public Health Department. And from what I hear, is highly engaged in COVID-19 relief. She holds a PhD in public administration from the University of North Texas. Her research and scholarship focuses on public and nonprofit governance and culturally competent leadership. While pursuing her PhD, she lectured at UNT, and she also, really happy to have her, is serving for a subject or as a subject matter expert with us for the launch of our social justice certificate. Dr. Duchess, thanks so much for being here with us today. Give me just one quick second and I'll make you a host, and then I'll let you go from there, okay?
Thank you, Dr. Taylor.
Hey, Will, does it, I'm not seeing that function as a co-host. Can you grab that?
Yeah, I think I can. Let me see. You probably still have to do the slides though for her, I think, Kenny. There you go.
All right, cool.
Oops, we lost her. Ah, she's coming back.
All right. Can you hear me?
Yep.
All right, awesome. Let's see here. All right. Kenny, are you going to control the slides for me, or am I going to have to do that?
I will, unless,
Okay.
unless you have it as a host. Yep, go ahead.
Oh yeah, I don't see how to do that on my end. All right, so I'll just go ahead and jump right in. Thank you again for having me. Today we're going to talk about cultural competence, and cultural competence specifically in nonprofit leadership. So we question first, why culturally competent nonprofit leadership? Why is this even necessary for nonprofits? Well, it's with the public character of the nonprofit sector, it's important because nonprofit leaders are able to steward the public character of the sector. In essence, through the lens of civil society, leaders are responsible for stewarding the public service responsibilities that are often delegated from government. Nonprofit leaders are also responsible for the mobilization and advocacy necessary to promote nonprofits as laboratories of citizenship. So these organizations provide citizens a voice. We are able to avoid and also solve particular problems within their specific milieu. And ideally, we're able to strengthen the community because we're giving them a voice. We're giving them entree to act as, again, that mobilization and advocacy center for them. Another way we can look at this is through the lens of voluntary action. When we're looking through this lens, we see that leaders at the structural levels of both governance and also management, they're able to promote this autonomous and self-governing ability at the decision-making table. Specifically, the board, who is responsible for decision-making at the very top of that leadership structure, they're recruited from the public, right? They are voluntarily serving to engage and also steward that publicly accepted mission while also operating under the assumption of the non-distribution constraint, which means that the board does not have the ability to be compensated for their service. So again, there's this voluntary action that they're able to, these leaders are able to facilitate and also foster. Moreover, leaders of nonprofits are facilitators of the creation of trust, social inclusion, and also communal engagement. Next slide. All right, so in continuation of this question as to why cultural competency is important for nonprofit leadership, we are looking at this particular graphic or this data from BoardSource, a study that they did in 2016 with the Leading with Intent study. We show first, we're gonna look at the demographics of, the demographic profile of boards and executives. So if we look at race and ethnicity, we largely see that the cultural majority in our society or the racial majority in our society often head leadership. For instance, there are 90% of, or during this time of this study, there were 90% Caucasian chief executives or CEOs, executive directors, 90% board chairs, and also 84% of white or Caucasian board members. If we look at the cultural and also racial minority, we see that they're a minority in leadership of nonprofits. One interesting facet that I've noticed about this study is that when we look at gender, we see that males are typically not serving in management leadership. However, if we go to the board chairs or often serving on those boards, we see that they are very representative in that area of governance, right? Again, that's the top of that leadership structure of the organization, which kind of shows, or actually shows, that women are not as representative on our governing boards, at least at the time of this study. When we move to the chief executive's satisfaction with the current board diversity, what we see is often these boards, or these chief executives were dissatisfied with the racial mix of and the racial composition of their boards. Also, when board chairs were asked about their satisfaction with the diversity on their boards, they too were dissatisfied. Next slide, Kenny. All right, so the starting point, cultural competence. The starting point of any discussion about diversity and inclusion must first include cultural competence. I note that cultural competence or culturally based culturally based programming, multiculturalism, diversity training, political correctness, equal opportunity, affirmative action, social equity. These all refer to a myriad of issues that herald the need for further inquiry. But while these concepts provide some acknowledgement of cultural variation, they are distinctly different from cultural competency. Cultural competency draws upon the increased access provided by institutionalized diversity management agendas, and this allows the acceptance of cultural differences of both the internal and external mechanisms and persons to the organization. So in other words, we must shift our thinking and shift from looking at hiring numbers or affirmative action and assimilation to actually that valuation of differences and managing diversity in nonprofit organizations. And this is supported by Dr. Mitchell Rice and also Dr. Harvey White. Cultural competence, it actually converts the knowledge that we gain about groups and individuals into policies and procedures that will increase the quality of services to produce better outcomes. And this notion is supported by Dr. Abraham Benavides and Julie Hernandez. All right, to fully understand cultural competence, we must conceptualize the term by culture and also competence. One way to think of culture is to view it in terms of the iceberg model. What you see here are artifacts at the top of this iceberg, and these are the tangible aspects that are presented to the public. They are those observable, obvious, important elements such as the mission and vision statements, those values and ethics statements, the bylaws, and even those articles of incorporation, which we as nonprofit leaders often forget about. Underneath those artifacts are espoused beliefs and values. These are acted out, and they're the observable behaviors that are constructed by that interplay between the external and internal physical and social environments. These beliefs may not be consistent with the published values or even those other tangible artifacts. They're generally validated by shared experience. Underneath are these underlying assumptions. These are at the very bottom of the iceberg. These are the organization's attitudes, those thought processes and actions. And often these are unconscious, but they are ingrained so deeply in the organizational culture that those within the organization they're unaware of the influence. They're those unspoken perceptions, those thoughts, those feelings that, although not obvious on the surface, are actually the primary source of values and actions, particularly those values and actions when engaging with that constituent public. They are generally based upon histories that subscribe to something as simple as we've always done it this way. I know many of us have heard our board say that, right? We've always done it this way, it works this way. Well, that's because there's that underlying assumption that it's going to work that way again. But here we have to understand that that's only providing a sense of security, not really security. All right, so competence, simply put, or simply stated, is the capacity to effectively put into skilled action public service agendas within the context of developing knowledge regarding the espoused beliefs, perceptions, and values of the internal and external stakeholder interests. All right, so putting it all together, we understand cultural competency, but there's not really an agreed upon definition of cultural competency. The following definitions of cultural competency are referenced as we develop a contextual understanding of its use and need in nonprofit organizational leadership, especially with those organizations with a social service focus. So the first definition we see is respect for and understanding of diverse ethnic and cultural groups, their histories, traditions, beliefs, and value system in the provision and delivery of service. A second definition of cultural competency is it's a set of congruent behaviors, attitudes, and policies that come together in a system, agency, or professional, which enable that system, agency, or professional to work effectively in cross-cultural situations. The third definition is cultural competency is simply the ability to effectively interact with individuals that are different from oneself. All right, to flesh out and make sense of those definitions, I adopt the cultural competency model. This model was created by Dr. Mitchell Rice and Dr. Harvey White. And it shows that cultural competency is not static. In fact, it's a very fluid process that moves in a manner that empowers the desire to engage in the process of learning about various means. One might understand, communicate with, serve, and also meet the values and needs of a diverse population within a given society, especially those within our constituent public. All right, so at the very top of our framework or our model is this notion of learning about cultures. Next slide, Kenny. All right, so in learning about cultures, this involves us asking those within the structures of governance and also management, how are we integrating and transforming knowledge about those being served, especially those policies and standards and practices that we've created and how we've fostered culture and negotiated culture and also institutionalized culture. At this level, it requires leaders to really review the ongoing processes that are in place, those standards and those policies and practices. How do we use those to engage with our internal and external exchange and partnership between our constituent public and also our organization? And in other words, how are we creating, how are we negotiating and institutionalizing cultural competence at the organizational level? All right, at the next dimension of that framework or model is the acknowledgement of the influence of culture on the organization. Implementation and delivery of service requires first an acknowledgement of culturally based risks and strengths, and of course those assets that we have available, resources that are available, and also the motivations. In essence, acknowledgement helps us to understand and also observe the organization's own cultural rules and biases against that of the constituent stakeholder group in a more holistic manner, rather than simply imagining and unfoundedly perceiving problems or risks of the client cultural group. Next slide. At the next level, we move to an awareness of cultural differences. Here, we're able to demonstrate our capacity to, and also the ability to act in an empathetic and supportive manner. We're recognizing those nuances and, of course, those important cultural values of our constituent public. We are careful, of course, not to engage in cultural imposition, that is that tendency to impose our beliefs and values and patterns of behavior on our constituent public. So at this level, it's also important that we're first open to change, right? Change is one of those things in a nonprofit, especially, that's very, very hard. Culture is very hard to change, but we have to be aware of our own cultural and behavioral impacts on that of our constituent public. And third, we have to be willing to assess and modify our values, assumptions, and also policies. All right. Okay, so the next level is knowledge and understanding of other cultures. This involves the process of seeking and obtaining cultural knowledge to ensure culturally appropriate resources are provided to our constituent public. We must ask the important cultural questions here. Susan Gooden actually wrote a wonderful book, The Nervous Side of Government, or Nervousness of Government. And in there, she says we have to ask those questions if we're ever going to be able to alleviate some of the inequities in our service, right? So we have to ask those important cultural questions. Here, we're mindful of the impact of the dominant culture on individuals and groups of oppressed and underserved communities. we're, as culturally competent persons, we're able to engage in those culturally competent evaluations. These evaluations, of course, must be consistent with the values and beliefs and behaviors of the minority groups being served, but also with the organization's behaviors, beliefs, and also values that we have instituted and abide by. All right, at this level of our model, we are engaging and integrating cultural awareness, knowledge, and sensitivity. So upon our cultural evaluation or cultural competency evaluation, we're able to engage with our constituent public, and we're demonstrating that we have a conceptual and also substantive understanding of their histories, their values, their policies, communication styles, beliefs and practices, their economy. And upon our engagement, we're then able to go back and assess our own cultural understanding of the service delivery skills and practices of the organization. So we're able to acknowledge and accept that cultural differences do exist and that they are impactful. We understand the role of the natural system, where we acknowledge that there is a conflictual nature between the values of the dominant mainstream group and those of the minority cultural group. However, we have to remember that we must respect that each individual has culturally defined needs. Moreover, we recognize that the concepts of individual, family, and community, they differ greatly. All right. All right, so again, once cultural competency it's a process, right? So once we reach this level of culturally competent nonprofit leaders, we've, I guess, become culturally proficient in a sense. But again, there's this ongoing process that never ends, because our external environment, we're always constantly having to adapt to. And we're always going to have to seek knowledge, and that knowledge is necessary to add to the practice of both cultural competence and also to the social justice component that is necessary in order to make certain that various groups have a voice, have a seat at the table. But as culturally competent nonprofit leaders, what has happened is we've assessed and performed those culturally specific evaluations, and we're able to disseminate that culturally specific information both formally and also informally to the constituent public and also to the wider public. At all levels of leadership, that is the board and also management, we've developed new approaches to better serve the mission of our organizations. As stewards, we're then able to champion cultural competency because we have a wonderful understanding about what cultural competency is. In essence, the culturally competent leader that operates in the nonprofit sector knows that within those structures of both governance and also management, that they have to continuously seek to add to the knowledge base of culturally competent practice. In essence, they have to conduct research. They have to develop new approaches that are based on culture. And they have to disseminate those results, of the results of those demonstration processes and projects, so that the constituent public can review them and have that opportunity to disagree or agree. So that, again, that cultural competency process becomes an ongoing fluid process. One other thing that culturally competent leaders will do is hire staff who are specialists in cultural competent practice. These leaders will advocate, of course, they'll champion for cultural competence throughout the system, and also they'll improve upon the relations between cultures throughout society, both internal to the organization and external to the organization. All right. Another way that, other ways that we can continue to enhance culturally competent leadership is to first develop a common understanding of what cultural competency is throughout the organization. Again, I provided 3 definitions. They aren't too far from each other. They have lots of overlap, but again, that particular organization, whatever that organization, organizational mission is, they have to adopt their particular definition or develop a common understanding of what cultural competency is in their organization. From there, you promote an organizational culture that encourages that constant and consistent learning, and be open to change. Be very, very open to change, and base decision-making on solid research, not emotion. And oftentimes many nonprofit leaders base their decisions on emotions, and that can get the best of us. We have to evaluate policies and charters, especially those articles of incorporation that were created at the inception of the organization and haven't been looked at in 20 years. We have to go back and look at those to make certain that those directives are supportive of cultural competency. They're supportive of inclusiveness, especially in that dissemination of information and advocacy for minority group rights, all of which influence the culture of the organization. Next slide. All right, so another way we can, or actually the final 3 ways that I suggest that we can continue to enhance cultural competent leadership is to create a cultural competency action plan that is aligned with the mission and actionable vision of the organization. Secondly, we have to recruit, mentor, promote, and retain a culturally diverse staff who are values and mission centric. This does not mean we hire persons of underserved, from underserved populations just for window dressing. We don't want to get into that bad habit. We want to make certain those persons have the various human capitals and other capitals that are necessary to promote that mission, our mission, and make certain that those persons are espoused to the values that would make certain that our mission is sustained long-term. Thirdly, we have to allow staff to immerse with the community. By immersing with the community, they're able to gain insight and self-awareness so as to provide culturally appropriate services. Moreover, they're able to promote social justice through that immersion. All right. Thanks for tuning in to our discussion. I am ready for questions.
I can't say that I've been paying much attention to the chat, but if anyone had a question in the chat room or one that's on your mind presently, feel free to go ahead and shoot.
I didn't see anything in the chat, Kenny. So yeah, folks got a question, go on ahead.
This is Tasha Cantrell-Bruce. Do you mind if I ask you a question, Doctor?
Absolutely, you may ask me a question, Tasha.
Oh, good, thank you. Well, I work, well, I'm very intrigued and impressed with your presentation, and it's a little, I'm still processing all of it.
Mhm.
I was curious, as you've looked at the research, not just locally, but across the states, to see if you've seen any trends. I work with a few different state agencies in different states, and I'm noticing a few trends that I'm not sure if it's nationwide or state-based, where they've changed from nonprofits that are applying for grants, where in prior years, maybe I don't want to give too much away as far as the state contract, but where a state used to give a contract, give 2 contracts. One was a minority grant and one was a community grant. And now they have, in one state in particular, they've gotten rid of those 2 separate grants. And you have to work together, which is great, collaboration and maximizing human capital in that way. But they've also gotten rid of the word minority and priority populations, and instead want nonprofits to identify marginalized populations, whether that be ethnicity, health-based, lifestyle choices. Have you witnessed this in any, these are a couple of Midwestern state agencies that I've noticed this in helping people write grants. Have you noticed this in any other situations, and how that fits with cultural competency in your iceberg model?
All right, great question. I can't say that I've seen research that identifies that, but I will say that there is scholarship that suggests that we have to identify those disparities in terms of ethnicity and race, socioeconomic status, gender, and gender identity when we are considering that service and delivery to the constituent public. So I'm assuming that the terms minority would not be all encompassing enough. So we want to be specific in identifying those disparities, especially those who have historically been underrepresented and have been prohibited from having a seat at the table. I hope I answered your question.
It was helpful. It was helpful. It's just a lot of new words and a lot of new procedures this year. And I just trying to get a feel for what's going on across the research. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am. Great question.
I've got one. I wanted to focus. I did want to make a comment about what Tasha was saying. Yeah, I read an article. Gosh, I'm going to have to find it. And I sent it to my staff a couple years ago about the language we use as nonprofits, that it can very much compartmentalize and continue that idea of oppressing the groups that we're supposed to be lifting up just by minority or oppressed or people. I don't know what the correct way to move forward. So this ties into my question. I work at a food bank, so we've got a very diverse staff, and I don't mean diverse, and I'm not talking about diverse in just race and gender. I'm talking and sexual orientation. I'm talking about education level. So to get and comfort and understanding, I would think with some of the terms that we've been talking about today. So do you have suggestions on curricula that would be good for what we call, I hate the term, concrete and carpet staffs that have manual labor workers as well as folks that are in offices, but that I would not want to leave anyone out on these kinds of discussions or trainings?
I'm going to pass that question to Dr. Taylor or Dr. Brown. I'm not for certain about any curricula at this time, but they are right at the helm of all that great stuff, right?
Yeah, I think part of the conversation actually, it has come up before. So to Tasha's question a little earlier, some of the literature that I've read and some of the environments that I've been in, we talk about negative connotations. And so one of the things that I try to be in the habit of is simply asking. Otherwise, we don't know. But I think I had a conversation with a colleague at the school about the word minority, even though it is, popular in academic settings, just in saying the word minority, it kind of starts off with the negative connotation. And depending on who you're, talking to, some may take offense to it while others kind of understand because it's been such a long standard. But Teresa, I think to your question, none of us are exactly sure how we should identify certain folks. So what I found that's helpful is simply asking and having that conversation. So to the point of today's conversation in relation to, cultural competent leaders, just asking, because we don't know until, we do that with the populations that we are leading in our organizations or the populations that we work with. And that's not to say, it certainly gets messy in every environment, but the cultural competence piece is us as leaders, those that are in the positions of leadership, making sure that regardless of who it is that you're talking about, to ask someone personally in the group, especially if you're working closely with that population and that's not going away, or someone that you're going to interact with on a go forward basis, we have to ask. And I think it just kind of starts there, and then we learn from that and we can incorporate that into, how we go about our day as leaders in relation to whoever it is that, we come across.
Getting a couple of questions on the chat box asking about resources or additional material, books to read, or best practice kinds of information. So Dr. Humphrey or Dr. Taylor, if you got ideas about resources that might be useful.
I can provide a list of resources that I have, and
If you give that to us, we can make it
Okay.
available with the
Mhm.
presentation.
Perfect. I will do that.
On
I
that
will definitely do
resource
that.
that I posted that. So
Okay.
we'll compile that. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Yes, sir.
The other thing I guess I should mention is, I referenced it a little earlier, is we're on the front end of starting to populate, our resource page with, cultural competent leaders, leadership material, and things that we're engaging in relation to the launch of our social justice leadership certificate. So you can certainly look to, I think we'll provide the link for you if it hasn't been provided already in the chat just yet, but our next slide, I guess I can just click over to it here real quick. And I'll come back to, if you go to the link there, you'll see a resource page, and there'll also be information on there about our social justice activity that will provide some of the resources that folks ask about. And then we'll be happy to, Dr. Humphrey, add your stuff as well too, just as sure we get beyond the presentation today. About other questions from folks?
I got another one here in the chat box. Shauna posts one about asking, how do you balance the sort of tendency to listen to, one voice or just one perspective? It kind of blended with a concern about limited resources, right? So not relying on one person to give the perspective of a whole culture or something along that line. So just some reflections on how do we, yeah, you can't have everybody in your organization. You can't have everybody on your board. So some thoughts about not overemphasizing any one perspective, perhaps, might be another way to think about the question. Shauna, you can jump in too if you want to refine that in some way.
No, I think you hit the nail on the head. Just trying to really look at, sometimes folks rely on, and you have to start somewhere, right? You have to, recruit people, hire people from different walks of life, but how do you really ensure that you're looking outward a little bit? You're listening to that person, but not relying on them to be, that voice, only that voice.
Right. Well, I think that, thank you, Shauna. That's a great question. I think that first we have to understand and respect the fact that one person cannot represent the whole. Again, as an African-American woman, I can't represent all African-American women. That's not possible. But what value I do add to the conversation is my own experience in that particular culture or in those particular cultures. And being a culturally competent leader, what will happen is I will be able to accept and acknowledge the fact that culture, my representation of culture is not going to be monolithic. It's not monolithic to those who share the same culture with me. So understanding that, and then making certain that that board or those leaders are recruiting others, and I'm also bringing other people in to share their experiences, share their knowledge. Again, making certain that that cultural competency process is very fluid and it's constantly moving. It can't stagnate by standing still and making one person representative of the whole.
Maybe picking up on that a little bit, Carol was asking about if you can think of sort of common mistakes that organizations sometimes make. It seems like it relates to that in a way, or things you've seen where people can, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I think that often boards, for instance, they have to fill those seats with persons from underrepresented situations. So again, using African-American or being an African-American woman, they want to put an African-American in that seat to show that they are representative of diversity. They are acknowledging that there's this need for a person of color on their board. Well, if that's not intentional, And by intentional, what I mean is that having that understanding that that person of color is going to add a certain amount of expertise. They're going to add those capitals that are needed to ensure that that mission is continuously representative or represented in those particular cultures that have been disenfranchised and also did not have a seat at that table prior. We have to make certain that those persons have that culture. Don't just recruit them for window dressing. That is a common mistake that many boards do. And I'm speaking of boards, but I'm pretty certain that CEOs are also put in that particular, or sometimes CEOs are recruited for those reasons as well. But again, that is a fallacy that I believe that's done. Having those window dressing, having leaders for window dressing is just not, it's not feasible. It's not.
And that builds a little bit on some of the research that we've tried to tackle inside, our center as well too. And it wasn't that long ago that I was out interviewing, Blacks and others of color that sit on nonprofit boards or thinking about transitioning into the nonprofit industry. And one of the things that was highlighted fairly consistently was, even if I'm on a board, I didn't get the sense that my opinion was truly valued at the organization. And so, what I would certainly challenge, anyone who's, at a nonprofit organization that's joining us today or other settings is, if you have, let's just say, only one or two, people of color on your board, maybe just, question yourself along the lines of developing, evolving as a cultural competent leader. To what extent, or what do you remember about their contribution, their value on your board outside of just being there? What contributions have they made to their organizations? Because I will say that's the thing that's highly important. And so there seems like there's a lot of passion in communities of color to serve on boards. If you think about, the neighborhoods that we live in, things like that, there's tons of passion there. And the buildup is pretty exciting, where you finally make it to, let's just say, in this example, becoming a board member. So you've had some trouble along the way, even accessing a nonprofit organization at that level, regardless of your background, a lawyer, doctor, whoever it may be. And then you get there. And when you get there, you personally start to get the sense that your opinion isn't valued, or what you thought it was going to be, it just isn't, in terms of the, the experience that you have there. And so my studies have kind of said, my experience has kind of said, that's really negative, because then what happens is, which I think is, what I also hear from nonprofit organizations is, it's so hard to recruit people of color.
Mm.
And one reason that might be is because they've had a bad experience to where, okay, I tried that before, my opinion wasn't valued, so now that's not a setting for me any longer. And then we default to our churches or individually in our communities.
Hmm.
Other questions?
I just have a comment. Pat Sorrells with Camp for All, and all we do serve all. But your point is well taken. We've had a board that has been diverse, but we have term limits. And one of my favorite people has just rolled off, and I'm going to him to see if he has any recommendations, but I'm also going to the board. But this is something we want to do. We think it's important, but we also, as a board, we require passion. We require the ability to reach out and find new donors, new people to get engaged with Camp for All. So it's a hard process, and I'm in the process of trying to figure out the best way to do it. So if you have any suggestions, more suggestions, and where to go, what to do, I'd appreciate it.
Yeah, I would just say I think you're on the right track. I heard a couple other things in my interviews that I did where, some nonprofits were specifically recruiting someone, a person of color, that they knew would hold them accountable as they think about how do they evolve as an organization in relation to being more, let's just say, culturally competent. And so if you go out and intentionally recruit someone, the reaction was really twofold. So one reaction is, I'm happy to play that role for you. I'm interested in that. The other reaction was, I don't know that I want that role because, again, kind of back to the comment that I made not too long ago was, I don't know that my opinion would be valued anyways, and I'm not going to allow you to use me in that way. So though I heard both, if you have those relationships, especially with someone that was on your board, again, I would just say, I think you're starting in the right place. But just to make sure that you are transparent around, you want someone to hold you accountable if that's a discussion that you're having at the board level. And just as sure as you can identify who that person is, or a few folks like that, I think that would do wonders for an organization to make sure that then their voice is certainly heard and they know exactly what their role is. I think the confusion is when someone comes onto your board, a person of color, who doesn't necessarily understand exactly what their role is, and they feel like a lone wolf in trying to push that conversation down the road a bit in your organization.
I think also um, the organization has to develop value statements that are indirectly, and also directly involve that indirectly and directly involve inclusiveness and also diversity. So that value statement can say something along the lines of, we're committed to the equitable treatment and elimination of discrimination, or we have a commitment to diversity in all staff and volunteers, or a commitment to individual and organizational efforts. So using those sorts of words and actually meaning what you say. To me, that's important, especially when you're trying to recruit persons of color. They will see those particular value statements and be able to wrap their head around that and also subscribe to it.
And that is in our values. And I think as far as who we serve, and I think now we're thinking we're obviously more broadly thinking in terms of we're inclusive in staff, incredibly inclusive in staff, and trying to be in board. And I think that's our hardest area. But it is in our values, I'm proud to say.
Great.
I mean, one observation I might have, right, Pat, is it is a process, right? That's pretty clear about all the messaging here, is that it's an evolving, it's an awareness, but a desire to move toward more equity or more inclusion, but we don't fully get there, right? Because we never really fully understand and fully be able to integrate everything in our organization. So the efforts and consistency of working toward those objectives is another big piece of what we have to be a little comfortable with in part of this, is that we're working toward objectives that we may not be able to fully achieve certainly in the short term, but maybe even, in long term, but it's just kind of continuous process of trying to move toward it. It makes it a little uncomfortable in some ways too, right? Because we want to be able to say, oh, we've achieved cultural competency in our organization, and now we serve everybody with this sophisticated deep understanding. But the reality is it's an evolving process as people come and go. That was your observation, right? People come and go, different people come into our organization, different things happen. And that's a piece that I've come to terms with in some ways.
That's why it's very important that at the level of at the organizational level, that culture is fostered, that culture of cultural competency is fostered by our leaders. It starts there.
Yeah, always use ourselves
go on
as an
ahead.
example. Just quickly, our value of opportunity for all within our, Center for Nonprofits and Philanthropy, and I never want to come across when we have opportunities like this, like we have it figured out, because we don't. So it's an evolving process. We have a statement that we want to be open to all and that we value the opportunity for all to participate, but what I think we've learned is we think about it in different ways. So having the conversation helps. And just like Dr. Brown just said, I mean, it goes up and down and folks think about it differently, but simply having the conversation is a great starting point and just working really hard to get down the road with it. The example that I tend to use is people just, people think about it in so many different ways, and it's tough to figure out for all of us. So having the conversation just helps.
David just kind of posted an interesting question about, if they're in discussion and decision-making in their organization, and they try to include people of color, trying to be able to think about who's involved in the conversation, but then it comes down to sometimes a majority decision or a consensus-based decision, which can then and in this instance, maybe the minority voice, wherever it's coming from, may feel like it's not being reflected or not being carried forward. And thoughts about sort of providing that equity or equality in decision-making, right? Because there is a tendency to want to just, well, let's just take a vote and let the majority rule. It's just an interesting question. If you have thoughts on that, Kenny or Duchess.
I tend to think about compromise a bit, right? So introducing something at a board meeting that could be, I didn't see the question personally other than, Will, what you just relayed, but if.
And David, if you want to clarify, go on ahead.
Yeah, just real quick, I mean, compromise. I mean, sometimes it would seem like, I've been in that situation before. If you're the only one at the table, let's just say the only Black person in the room and on a board, and you have to take a vote. And if you're not feeling exactly that way, that's what's going to win. It could certainly be discouraging on some level. But to what extent do you have conversations about the issue that was raised as a board? Was it truly discussed in a fashion that would be, say, for something related to your budget, where it was a very thoughtful conversation, a quick decision wasn't made, maybe it was tabled to get more information? If that process, again, from my perspective, is not happening when you have people of color on a board, then surely I would think that those folks would feel like, back to that point I made about being valued, that what I believe or what I'm feeling at the time in relation to whatever issue is on the table to be voted about, it just doesn't matter. So I think
you're pretty close, Dr. Taylor. And I think the situation we're struggling with is that, we're a leader body of primarily white men. And we have one man in particular who's indigenous. And, it's very difficult for us to step aside from our habits of, we need to make a decision about whether we're going to have this event. Okay, we all voted, 5 of us said yes and 1 said no, but he feels like, well, he's always in, when it's 5 against 1, he's always going to be on the losing side, but, we're having difficulty wrapping ourselves around the old habit of, oh, well, that's the way things have been, which, just, reeks of, systemic racism, in the sense of, oh, well, that's the way it's always been. Well, that doesn't mean that it's the right way. So it's like, oh, well, what are alternatives? And we're trying to wrap our head around that.
Yeah,
so that this man feels more welcome, that, that he, that his voice, and his objection to something carries weight.
I think that's why I went straight to compromise. And I guess, what I would say there is what would be wrong if whoever that person is, to go with that person's recommendation, and you can always see if that's something that works or shifts. So how many organizations would be open to doing just that, where you take the advice or you take the perspective or you implement what the one person on your board that's of color recommended, see how it works, and go from there.
Mhm.
It seems like there has to be some compromise in there somewhere along the way.
Right. Yeah, because our organization, we try to go for the both and the win-win. And so, yeah, that sounds good. Thank you so much.
Sure.
I think, I'm sorry, I want to say this too. I want to add to that, Kenny.
Yeah.
I think at the root of that compromise is that respect. Again, remember that definition of cultural competency, the first one that I read off was the respect for and understanding of diverse ethnic and cultural groups, respect for their histories, respect for their traditions, their beliefs, and also those value systems in the provision of delivery of service, but also in the organization. So at the organizational level, we also have to have that respect and understanding for their diverse and those persons who are serving. So respect goes a long way, but we without respect, there is no compromise, right?
Maybe time for one last question. And I guess if we don't hear or see one, we'll start to wrap up. But any last questions?
Well, I can ask one, but then we'll be on for another hour. You guys know me, I can drop the bombs. So we live in an area that is conservative in political leanings. And while this issue should not be partisan, it can be. I'll give you an example. When George Floyd was killed, so last year, and people took to the streets and there was advocacy and work being done, I asked my board if we could make a statement. And I got a lot of, why would we do that? We need to stay in our lane. What does that have to do with what we do? So there was some education that happened, and we did make a statement, and it was a collective statement that was developed by staff and board. We did leave out the people that we served, so I have to admit that was a big omission in that. But and just me saying serve is a bad way. The people we work side by side, I don't even know how to say what I do without saying it in an oppressive way. So I'm learning along the way. But we also sent that as a public statement on our website. It's a statement that was sent out to all of our donors, and we lost donors. I got some very interesting emails back, and very, I could go into detail, but people were not happy that the food bank was what they looked at as being political. They said we were being political by being equitable. So I just say that for everybody to be prepared. This is very important work, but it is not easy work. And if you dig in, you better be prepared to dig in for a long time and do some assessment yourself of yourself while you're doing it.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Teresa. Appreciate that. And I promise you, I've heard about that around Texas A&M and lots of other places where the reaction was exactly the same. So I guess that's an investigation of your values and where you stand on that. So yeah, I agree with you. If you stick to your mission of your organization and your values, and you just simply have to draw a line, I agree with you that folks or nonprofit public leaders should just expect that that's part of what will come your way. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. We always end with our upcoming events. So just briefly, we have a continuing education course on situational leadership that I'll be hosting on the 5th of May. Our next webinar will be on the 13th, related to performance measures for nonprofit organizations. On May 25th and 26th, our leadership and public service program. And then in August, as I mentioned a little earlier, again, a big thanks to Dr. Humphrey for joining us today. She'll be leading our class on cultural competency embedded within our social justice certificate And I am quite sure that the link that you see here, or bush.tamu.edu/nonprofit, is where you can find all of that information at. And we thank you all so much for joining us. Appreciate you.
Thank you.
Good to see you. Thanks so much for joining us. See lots of friends.
Dr.
Thank
Humphrey, thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Brown. Thank you, Dr. Taylor.
you. Thanks so much. Good to see you.
Likewise.
Hey, good job, guys. Always good to see you. Take care.
Royce,
Thanks,
take
Royce.
care.
Good to see you, man.
Thank you.
I can only speak from the minority here, but it's always good to be seen by Royce.
Yeah, representing one person, right?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
I
But
feel
we have
it,
to give,
Ron, I feel it too.
but what I've just heard is we have to give value to what he just said.
Absolutely.
Well,
Absolutely.
There was certainly value in
I was listening.
For Ron?
you know, respect is given where respect is offered, right?
You're